My talk is called $1 billion for open source maintainers. And it's not just like $1 billion one time, right? It's $1 billion per year. And that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Is it really? All right, so my name is Toby Langell. I'm a jazz drummer turned open source developer turned consultant in the open source space. I run a small consulting firm from Geneva, Switzerland called Unlock Open. And the whole sort of like supply chain security and sustainability of open source has been something that I've been talking about for a number of years at this point and that I actually care deeply about on a personal level too. What I want to do in those half an hour, which I should actually put a timer on for, 25 minutes that we have together, is to sort of make you think differently, change your mindset around how we think about money in open source, how we think about maintenance, start thinking beyond the open source way. What I'm not going to talk about at all, and that's kind of a cop-out, and it's easy for me to do that, I understand, it's who's actually going to pay for this $1 billion per year. Because I think first we actually have to understand that we need to ask for $1 billion per year before we actually figure out how to get that money. And also, I do want to sort of like have a disclaimer here. There are lots of different open source projects, lots of different open source communities, lots of different cases. What I'm talking about here might not work for you, and that's entirely fine, and it's also entirely okay. All right. So let's start by talking about money. So I was saying $1 billion per year sounds like a lot of money, but is it really? Let's do the math. Do you know how many developers there are in the world? Oh, this is an auction now. So there's lots of different numbers. Yes, what I heard here is like what's commonly shared. I'm actually using, so I chose to go with that stat. IDC came up with 16 professional professional software developers. There's different stats, and it doesn't really matter. It's just like the point is, it's a lot. And you know what the average salary worldwide is? So that's like super approximative, just to be clear. Yeah, that's not a bad take, actually. It depends also if you do the math, whether you do it loaded or unloaded, et cetera. So that's what Statista gave me when I looked it up recently. The methodology was like not very good, though. I ended up using $65,000. So if you do the math of this, that's $1 trillion every year spent on software development. $1 trillion is a lot. If you actually like pile up money, $100 bills, it's skyscraper size. It's an incredible amount of money. And so how much is 0.1% of $1 trillion? That's $1 billion, right? So if every one of those purpley square here is $1 billion, that's $1 trillion total. That's what we spend roughly, on software development every year. And this huge number that sounds entirely crazy to ask for, to think about, it's down there. You know what this is? That's the amount of open source code in an average code base, right? Come on, this is bizarre, no? I mean, like, we're talking about this small square down there, and like everyone came to this, to this talk, it's like $1 billion, this guy's insane. And this, like, we don't even talk about this. We're talking about, okay, we have 10K for a project here and there, right? And it's, this money that we don't have down there, that we don't even dare to think about, actually maintains this whole, 3/4 of the stack on this side. Right? So does it actually sound like that much? I was just talking in the corridor just before the talk, and just like, I should have anchored at 10 billion. That was silly of me. So next time it's $10 billion. Okay, second thing I want to talk about, maintenance. So here you all thinking, okay, he's a bit right about the money, but money is going to kill open source, right? And you're not alone in thinking so. Actually, DHH, regardless of what you think about the person, has talked about this in a way that I thought was interesting a while back in 2013. He said part of the reason much of open source is so good and often so superior to closed source commercial projects is the natural boundary of constraints. Right? People come to open source to scratch their own itch, and as a result, it sort of like focuses the kind of work that happens. So, you know, if you're not being paid or otherwise compensated directly for your work, you're less likely to needlessly embellish it. And, you know, I kind of subscribe to that ethos, and I think that's not entirely wrong, right? Like, the open source way has proven to be this incredible innovation engine, right? So how do we reconcile, on one end, wanting to keep this way of building software together in a very sort of like volunteer-driven way, in a scratch-your-own-itch way, but at the same time, also don't have all of the sustainability issues that we're facing, don't have all of the supply chain issues that we're facing. And I think like the key to that is to stop thinking about open source maintenance as like one single thing, and start thinking that, you know, maintenance is not innovation, right? It's like we can't think about open source development and open source maintenance as being the same thing. We have to like separate them, split them apart. Today, open source maintenance kind of looks like this, right? You have a developer that's maintaining a piece of software that everyone relies on. It's the Nebraska XKCD image. And they're exhausted, they're burning out. And someone shows up and says, here's 10K to support your work on this new feature. And, you know, 10K feels nice. Maybe that's going to support some of my maintenance work also, right? And the outcome is literally, now they have 15 features to support, right? And not more money to actually support it. As an industry in general, we suffer from featureitis, right? The way to start thinking about this differently, in my opinion, is to look at the way the project lifecycle works, which is a thing that we don't really do in open source in general. We kind of believe weirdly that open source projects live on forever. And start figuring out in that space how sort of like the role of open source developer and the role of open source maintainer work, and kind of like where they belong in that space. So, you know, your typical project, and there's lots of different models, and it doesn't really matter, but like the idea is like, there's like this initial phase, and then like there's this growth phase, a maturity, stability phase, and oftentimes at some point, some sunsetting. And if you look at this from a role perspective, at the beginning, an open source project is really driven by rapid innovation development. And as you go into growth and maturity, most of the work becomes maintenance. Of course, lots of overlap, absolutely. And you know, different projects have different sort of shape for this. But overall, that's not an entirely bad model to use. And it's interesting because it matches a number of other things and other ways that we actually think about open source projects in general. One of those ways, one of those ways is typically how we handle governance, right? We move from BDFL models by de facto for very young projects, and as the projects increase in maturity, we move toward open governance. If you're familiar with Simon Wardley and Wardley maps, this also matches Simon Wardley's model of genesis to custom built to product to commodity. Right? As we move from prototyping to actually having very stable components that I use in everything, we move from an ethos and a practice of rapid innovation to one of maintenance. Simon Wardley also talks about how this maps processes. And it would, of course, be ridiculous to apply Six Sigma to an early stage open source project. However, the more something becomes part of the collective infrastructure, the more it is commoditized, the more moving towards those practices actually makes sense. Right? So it's, the idea is not that like one of these systems, one of these like ways of working is better. It's like pick the right tool for the job. Essentially, it also works for your practices. Another model which is also similar is the pioneer settler town planner model. One that I like is also thinking about craft and moving towards industrialization. Similarly, hard skills shift to soft skills, right? The more a project is mature, the more what matters is how people are able to work together rather than actually solve technical problems. I can go on, right? Like make your schedule, manage your schedule. And so, the open source way is really, really about this initial phase. It goes, again, it goes beyond, it stretches. But my question is kind of like how, what would it look like going beyond this concretely? So going beyond the open source way. So this is how we think about open source today, right? We have like this volunteer unicorn dev maintainer that does all the things, and some vague funding somewhere maybe for something. The reality of today is actually this, right? Like we have a bunch of foundations and different entities that do a lot of things that we kind of take for granted. So this is not like having people funded to do open source development adjacent work is something that exists, right? That we benefit from on a regular basis. I've also put the security there at the bottom because it's kind of like on the line, depending on the projects. So what I'm asking for, what I'm suggesting we do is this mindset shift, right? Sort of like split the unicorn dev maintainer into these two distinct roles that tie to the way the projects grow over time, to the project lifecycle, so that we can essentially consider, not all the time, but when that's necessary and when that's useful for a project, sort of like shift the funded roles to include maintenance, right? And to me, that is how we can sort of like straddle this really hard question of how can we make open source today more sustainable, less disruptive to actual end users relying on it, while keeping our highly successful innovation engine. So back to the money I was talking about before, right? If we had $1 billion a year, we could fund 10,000 maintainers. And that's a lot of maintainers. I mean, I think it would be like, even if we had just 1,000 paid maintainers, it would entirely change the shape of the whole ecosystem overnight. And so how would we do this exactly? First of all, we need to figure out how to actually hire these people into dedicated legal entities. This could be a mix, right? It could be existing open source foundations, though there are some cases where that would be complicated from a legal perspective. There are solutions using existing physical hosts and founding platforms like Open Collective, for example, and Open Source Collective. We could imagine new entities, either for-profit or non-profit or both, entirely focused on maintenance. There is this new thing that came out of the Cyber Resilience Act called the open source steward concept, which, kind of goes in this direction, right? Like suggests something like this. And I think, the answer is probably a combination of all of this. We could think of maintenance as team organization. right? Instead of having maintainers kind of like figure out how to do stuff like randomly and like through Slack channels or whatnot, figuring out how others are doing it, we could essentially start building dedicated practices to maintenance. We could train maintainers. They could have proper management and think about career path. For smaller projects, we could imagine things such as fractional maintenance. And they could, of course, share resources across projects. The focus of that maintenance work could be all of these things, right? Security support and training, tooling and infrastructure, bug triaging, release engineering, documentation, compliance, which is going to become increasingly a big thing. And probably lots of others that you're thinking about right now. Some of which are already done by foundations, but not all of which. And then lastly, God, I'm good on the timing of this. This would be really good for maintainers too, right? Maintainers could benefit from part-time opportunities that right now are really hard. Like the reality in tech today is you either work for a big tech company or you're kind of like trying to figure every day out in a really ad hoc sort of like kind of gig economy style if you want to work in open source. And this is unpleasant. A lot of people who are struggling in open source are struggling in open source because they don't really are well aligned or they feel like they're not well aligned with the ethos of larger tech companies, which is entirely fine, right? Some people are and some people are not, but they don't really have another option. And this could be, to me, could be an interesting option, be able to do maintenance part-time, and this could also sort of like help fund the development of projects through part-time maintenance, like the other way around, like not the example that I showed before, where people are like getting money to build features and like doing that to do maintenance, but like exactly the opposite. People have a job that cover the bills where they're doing maintenance, and then if they want to do open source development to scratch their own itch or to do like a creative project, they can. Of course, proper management. We have a lot of, open source is a hard space for a lot of people, and there's a lot in my idea that comes from the fact that there's little money and little support. Healthcare. I mean, in lots of countries, this is actually a reality. Right? And better separation between maintenance work and actual development work. And we know that this model works. Like we've tried at a small scale with the Open Web Docs. This is a project that Jory Burson drove. It's essentially what used to be MDN, the team that used to essentially support the MDN web developer documentation, got let go as a number of people have been over the last few years as the economy tightened. And they got support from a number of different players, had an leverage essentially Open Collective and the fiscal hosting that Open Source Collective provides, and have been running as a sponsored team for a number of years, essentially providing infrastructure for the community to continue contributing to the project and also creating documentation. So it's a small example. It's not all of open source, but for that project it works. Like we sort of like understand the legal pathos to make this happen and the kind of benefit that we can get out of it. All right, so to recap. $1 billion is actually pocket change when we consider the value of open source. And there's recent research by Frank Nagel that shows that like those numbers, the value, the demand-led, supply-led value, I can't remember what the term is, I'm sorry. Anyway, it far outpaces those numbers. We should consider development and maintenance as two separate things because it really helps give us a different mental model to work with, and I think it drives us towards solving the problem in a better way. And I think that we can really, by thinking that way, shape a better future for not only open source, but also open source maintainers. What we still have to figure out, though, is where to get that money from. It's both sounds like a really big problem, but also there's increasingly governments are concerned across the world are concerned about the whole security of the supply chain, there's clearly a need to solve a lot of these problems. And again, as a disclaimer, like maybe this doesn't fit your project, or maybe this like really rubs you the wrong way, and I entirely understand, and that's fine. And I'm also happy to discuss it. But I think it's actually it's a way of looking that I think at least helps us think differently about the problem space. And I have time for questions.